In the years that followed the Civil War, the United States stood at a turning point. The chains of slavery had been broken, and the nation promised a new beginning. Amendments to the Constitution reshaped the very meaning of freedom. Once enslaved men and women were now recognized as citizens, with the right to vote and the hope of shaping their own destinies. For millions, this was the dawn of a brighter future, a chance to build families, own land, and take part in the civic life of a country that had so long denied them a voice. But every step toward progress met a wall of resistance. Across the South, many who had once held power could not imagine sharing it. To them, equality was not a promise, it was a threat. The courthouse and the ballot box became battlegrounds. While one side sought to secure justice and protect newfound rights, the other worked to dismantle them, using intimidation, political maneuvering, and, far too often, brutal violence. Communities found themselves caught in the middle of this struggle. In some towns, schools for freed children rose from the ashes of old plantations, only to be targeted by those who feared an educated new generation. Black families lined up to cast their votes, their heads held high, even as armed men loomed nearby to frighten them away. Every election season was tense, every courthouse hearing charged with more than just legal argument, it was about the very soul of the nation. Imagine living in that fragile moment. The war was over, but the peace was uncertain. Promises were written into law, but those promises were fragile, vulnerable to the will of local mobs or leaders who refused to change. For the freedmen of the South, each day was both hopeful and dangerous. To claim their rights meant to risk their lives. Yet they pressed on, because the possibility of freedom outweighed the fear of loss. This was Reconstruction, an era of potential and peril. And within it lay stories that reveal not only the courage of those who believed in democracy but also the lengths to which others would go to deny it. Among these stories is one that stands out for its tragedy and its lessons, the Colfax Massacre of 1873. It was more than just a violent clash, it was a turning point, a moment when the promise of freedom collided with the forces of resistance. As we begin this journey into the past, remember that history is not just a series of dates, it is lived experience. It is about people like us, making choices, facing danger, and holding on to hope. Their struggles shaped the world we live in today. By understanding their stories, we see more clearly the challenges of our own time. If you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, I invite you to support this channel. Hit the like button to help others discover this history, subscribe so you won't miss future episodes, and share this video with anyone who values truth, justice, and the lessons of the past. Together, we can keep these voices alive and ensure that the sacrifices made in pursuit of freedom are remembered. In the heart of Louisiana, on land once divided by plantations and battlefields, a new parish was born. It was called Grant Parish, and its creation was no ordinary administrative decision. It was the product of Reconstruction, a bold attempt to redraw the map of power in the South. Unlike the parishes around it, this one was designed with a purpose. Here, the majority of residents were formerly enslaved men and women, newly freed and eager to shape the course of their own futures. For the first time in the history of the region, black citizens held real political weight. This change was seismic. Imagine the courthouse steps, once a place where freedom was denied, now becoming a stage where newly elected officials of African descent spoke with authority. Freedmen lined up at polling stations, their voices counted in ways their parents and grandparents could never have dreamed. To them, Grant Parish was not just a home, it was a symbol of the promises etched into the nation's constitution. It was proof that democracy could work, even here, even now. But where some saw opportunity, others saw danger. For the white citizens who had long controlled the land, the idea of living in a parish where black voices guided politics was unthinkable. To them, this new arrangement was a direct assault on the world they believed should never change. It was not just about who held office, it was about the unraveling of an old order built on hierarchy and silence. The courthouse soon became the center of this struggle. On one side stood Republican leaders, often supported by the black majority, determined to protect the rights won in the aftermath of war. On the other side stood Democrats, who argued the parish had no legitimacy, that its government was a fraud, and that the courthouse belonged to them. Each faction claimed to be lawful, each insisted it carried the true mandate of the people, and each prepared to defend that claim. This clash was not abstract, it touched every household. Families spoke of politics at the dinner table with equal measures of pride and fear. Churches became gathering places, not only for prayer but for strategy sessions, where plans were whispered about how to keep hold of the fragile freedoms just gained. Farmers discussed more than crops, they talked about ballots, about rights, about rumors of militias forming in neighboring towns. For black families, the stakes were survival. The vote was not just about abstract representation, it was about securing safety, education for their children, and the hope of justice in courts that had long denied them fairness. For white families resisting change, the stakes were about control. Every ballot cast by a freedman felt to them like a piece of their old life slipping away. It was this tension, this daily pressure, that transformed Grant Parish into more than just a geographic place. It became a symbol of a larger national battle. Reconstruction was not happening in speeches alone, it was unfolding in small parishes like this one, where the future of democracy was tested in real time. As disputes escalated, neither side seemed willing to yield. Local Republicans pointed to federal laws and constitutional amendments as their shield. Democrats dismissed those same laws as illegitimate, foreign to their traditions, and argued they had the right to govern themselves without interference. What emerged was not just disagreement but dual governments, two groups of officials, both claiming to be the rightful authority of Grant Parish. With rival leaders came rival law enforcement. Warrants were issued from two separate offices, sometimes for the same individuals. Tax collectors demanded payment twice, once on behalf of one faction, once for the other. Ordinary citizens found themselves caught in the chaos, never certain whose orders to obey or whose protection was real. Every encounter risked violence. The tension hung like storm clouds. Courthouses, schools, and even churches felt the strain of division. Every election became a showdown, with whispers of voter intimidation, forged ballots, and armed men lurking near the polls. Fear settled into daily life, and yet so did determination. For the freedmen of Grant Parish, this was a fight worth facing. They had tasted freedom, and they were unwilling to surrender it. What makes this story gripping is not just the political maneuvering but the courage of ordinary people. Imagine being a farmer, rising before dawn to tend the fields, knowing that by afternoon you may need to stand guard at the courthouse with a rifle. Imagine being a mother, watching your husband and sons leave the house to defend leaders chosen by the community, unsure if they would return by nightfall. These were not abstract debates, they were lived choices, etched in the daily lives of families trying to hold on to fragile hope. Grant Parish, in this moment, became a crucible. It concentrated the hopes of Reconstruction and the fury of its opposition into one small corner of Louisiana. And as the struggle intensified, the courthouse at Colfax would soon become the stage for a confrontation that would send shockwaves far beyond its wooden steps. The conflict brewing here was more than local. It was about who would define the meaning of freedom in America, the vision of equality promised in the aftermath of war, or the demand to restore the order that had been shattered. The answer, as we shall see, would come at a terrible cost. The courthouse in Colfax stood like a beacon in the heart of Grant Parish. It was not just a building of wood and brick, it was the symbol of authority, the place where laws were made visible, where the voice of the people became action. For the black community who had fought to gain their rightful place in the political life of Louisiana, this courthouse represented something more than civic duty, it was the living proof that their votes and their voices mattered. In the spring of 1873, that symbol came under direct threat. Rumors swept across the countryside, whispers of armed groups gathering, of plans to seize control of the parish government by force. The memories of intimidation at polling stations were still fresh, and now the talk was not of ballots but of rifles. For many in the community, it was clear, the courthouse had to be defended, or everything they had gained since the end of the war could be lost in a single violent day. Leaders stepped forward. They were farmers, preachers, tradesmen, ordinary men called into extraordinary roles. Together, they organized patrols and called on their neighbors to prepare. They were not seasoned soldiers, but they understood what was at stake. To them, defending the courthouse was not about holding a building, it was about protecting the fragile hope of a democratic future. Families contributed in every way they could. Some carried water and food to those who kept watch at night. Others supplied tools to reinforce the windows and doors. Wooden barricades went up across entryways, and firing slits were cut into walls so that defenders could see without exposing themselves. The courthouse was transformed from a simple civic space into a fortress of determination. Militias formed, though the term carried more symbolism than structure. They were neighbors with old muskets, hunting rifles, and whatever arms they could gather. Many of these weapons were outdated, relics from past conflicts, but in the hands of men driven by necessity, they became instruments of protection. Drills were held in the yard outside, not with the precision of an army but with the urgency of a community preparing for survival. The mood inside the courthouse was tense but resolute. Leaders held meetings by lantern light, discussing how to respond if attacked, where to station men, how to hold their ground. Some argued for negotiation, for sending messages to state authorities to ask for protection. Others believed that help would not arrive in time, that only their own resolve could preserve what they had built. In the end, they prepared for both possibilities, hoping for peace but steeling themselves for war. Women and children played their part as well. Mothers taught their children to stay quiet if danger came near. Some families sent their youngest away to stay with relatives in the countryside, far from the brewing storm. Yet many chose to remain close, unwilling to abandon husbands, brothers, and fathers who stood guard over the courthouse. Their presence was a silent testimony to the courage of an entire community, not just those who held weapons. As days passed, the defenders grew more organized. Watchmen were placed on rooftops, scanning the roads that led into town. Scouts moved quietly through the woods, listening for news of hostile gatherings. Messages arrived, reports of large groups assembling in neighboring parishes, carrying banners and weapons, vowing to retake control of Grant Parish. Each report tightened the sense of urgency inside the courthouse. Yet amid the fear, there was also pride. For the first time, these men were not being told what their future would be, they were deciding it for themselves. Standing inside that courthouse, armed and alert, they felt the weight of history on their shoulders. They knew the risks, but they also knew the meaning of their stand. If they held the courthouse, they held the very idea of equal citizenship. If they lost it, the dream of Reconstruction in their parish could crumble overnight. The nights were the hardest. Darkness brought silence, broken only by the shifting of men on watch or the distant barking of dogs. Every sound carried suspicion, a snapping twig, a rustle in the grass, perhaps a sign of an enemy moving closer. Yet dawn always came, and with it another day of waiting, another day of determination. The defenders drew strength from one another, from the sight of familiar faces standing shoulder to shoulder. What made the defense remarkable was not the strength of their weapons but the strength of their purpose. They were not professional soldiers. They were citizens defending the legitimacy of their elected officials, men standing for the principle that the will of the people should not be overturned by force. Their resolve was a message, that freedom, once claimed, could not be surrendered without resistance. The courthouse in Colfax, fortified by wooden beams and guarded by determined hands, became the heart of a fragile but powerful stand. It was a place where ordinary people prepared to face extraordinary danger, not because they sought conflict, but because they refused to let go of the promise of democracy. The world around them was shifting, and they understood that their actions in those tense weeks would echo far beyond the walls of that small building. And so, with the courthouse barricaded and watchmen posted, the black community of Grant Parish braced itself. The storm they had feared was drawing nearer. They did not know when it would strike or how fierce it would be. But they knew this much: they would meet it together, and they would meet it on their own terms, defending the place that symbolized their hard-won rights and their fragile new beginning. In the spring of 1873, tension in Grant Parish reached a breaking point. While the black community fortified the courthouse in Colfax, determined to protect their elected officials and the fragile promise of Reconstruction, their opponents were gathering strength of their own. Among them was Christopher Columbus Nash, a former Confederate officer whose influence stretched across the parish. To men who refused to accept the new political order, Nash was more than a leader, he was a rallying figure, a symbol of resistance to the changes reshaping Louisiana. Nash and others like him believed the courthouse was theirs by right, no matter what the ballots had shown. To them, the presence of black officials and community leaders in positions of power was not just unwelcome, it was intolerable. Slowly, deliberately, plans were laid to overturn what had been won. What began as whispers in taverns and on porches grew into open calls for action. The courthouse must be taken back, and it must be done by force. They did not act alone. Across Louisiana, groups had begun to form in opposition to Reconstruction governments, organizations that blended politics with the threat of violence. The most powerful of these was the White League, a paramilitary force that recruited veterans, planters, and anyone willing to carry a rifle in the name of restoring order. Unlike secret societies, the White League was bold, marching openly, training in daylight, and declaring its intent to drive Reconstruction from the South. With Nash at the center, alliances were forged. Word spread to neighboring parishes, calling on sympathizers to join. Men rode in on horseback, rifles slung across their backs, answering the summons with a sense of grim purpose. By the time their gathering reached its peak, more than 300 armed men had pledged themselves to the cause. They were not a ragtag mob but an organized force, prepared to use military tactics learned during the Civil War. The numbers alone told a story of intimidation. Where the defenders of Colfax were farmers, laborers, and tradesmen with scattered hunting rifles, Nash's force came with firepower and training. Some carried pistols tucked into their belts, others bore shotguns or repeating rifles. Many wore pieces of old uniforms, remnants of a war lost less than a decade before, now repurposed for a new battle. Their gathering was not just about weapons, it was about sending a message: the courthouse would not remain in the hands of those who had claimed it through Reconstruction politics. Meetings were held under oak trees and in the back rooms of homes, where plans took shape. The strategy was simple yet decisive: surround the courthouse, cut off escape, and force a surrender. If surrender did not come, they would storm the building. Every man who joined knew that violence was likely, perhaps inevitable. But to them, it was a price worth paying to reclaim what they believed had been taken. As the day of action drew closer, the countryside buzzed with expectation. Farmers in nearby fields saw columns of armed riders passing by. Families whispered behind closed doors, some fearful, others quietly supportive. The roads leading into Colfax echoed with the sound of hooves and the metallic rattle of weapons. An army was forming, not sanctioned by any government, but powerful enough to shape the future of the parish. Nash, at the head of this gathering, carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed he was acting with destiny on his side. His speeches to the men emphasized loyalty, honor, and the need to restore rightful authority. Each word fueled their determination. They were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to reclaim the courthouse, to erase the sight of black men defending political power, and to reassert a vision of control that Reconstruction had sought to dismantle. The stage was set. On one side stood the fortified courthouse, filled with community leaders and defenders resolved to protect their rights. On the other marched a force 300 strong, armed and organized, determined to crush that stand. Colfax was no longer just a quiet parish town, it had become the front line in a larger struggle for the meaning of freedom in the South. The morning of April 13, 1873, broke heavy with silence in Colfax. Inside the courthouse, black defenders stood watch at the windows, scanning the roads, their nerves stretched thin after days of waiting. They knew an attack could come, but no one could predict how overwhelming the storm would be. By midday, the horizon filled with movement, riders advancing in tight formation, rifles gleaming in the sunlight. The force that Christopher Columbus Nash and his allies had assembled was now bearing down on the town. The defenders braced themselves. Shots rang out first from a distance, echoing across the fields, followed quickly by the crackle of return fire from the courthouse. For hours, volleys of gunfire rattled through the small town. Smoke and dust clouded the air as men shouted orders, ducked behind barricades, and fired from hastily cut openings in the courthouse walls. Though outnumbered and poorly armed, the defenders fought with determination, knowing that retreat meant abandoning their leaders and surrendering their future. But the attackers came with numbers, discipline, and firepower. They pushed closer, tightening their grip around the courthouse. At one point, defenders attempted a desperate breakout, but most were forced back inside under a hail of gunfire. Ammunition ran low. The barricades that had seemed so strong began to feel like a trap. By late afternoon, the attackers shifted tactics. If they could not break through, they would burn the defenders out. Torches were lit. Flames caught on dry wood and shingles, spreading quickly along the courthouse walls. Thick black smoke poured through windows, stinging the eyes and choking the air inside. Panic spread among the men trapped within. Some tried to douse the flames with buckets of water, others pressed cloths to their faces to breathe. Mothers who had stayed near their husbands screamed for their families to escape. It was clear the fire would consume them all. With no way out, some defenders laid down their weapons and surrendered, stepping into the open with hands raised, trusting in the universal gesture of mercy. They had fought bravely, and now they sought only to live. But mercy was not given. The moment of surrender turned into a slaughter. Many of those who had yielded were shot where they stood. Others were taken prisoner, only to be executed later. By nightfall, the courthouse was nothing but a smoldering ruin. The air reeked of smoke and gunpowder. Bodies lay scattered across the grounds, the final toll staggering. More than 100 black defenders were dead. Some had perished in the flames, others under gunfire, and many more after they had already given up the fight. On the other side, only 3 attackers lost their lives. The imbalance told its own story, a battle that had become a massacre. The silence that followed was deafening. Survivors who managed to flee carried with them memories they would never forget, the crackle of fire, the cries of their neighbors, the sound of shots delivered long after resistance had ceased. The courthouse that once stood as a symbol of hope now lay in ashes, its charred remains a haunting monument to both courage and tragedy. In the days that followed, the attackers declared victory, claiming they had restored order in Grant Parish. But for the black community, the cost was incalculable. Families were shattered, leaders were lost, and the fragile promise of Reconstruction lay in ruins. What had happened in Colfax was not simply a clash over a courthouse, it was the destruction of a dream that freedom and equality could take root in the South without fear. The Colfax tragedy stood as one of the most devastating acts of violence in the Reconstruction era, its scale and cruelty unmatched. It was a turning point, a moment when the nation's promise of democracy met the full force of resistance. And while the courthouse burned to the ground, the memory of what happened there could not be so easily erased. In the aftermath of the Colfax tragedy, the smoldering courthouse became more than a local ruin, it became a national test. News of the massacre spread quickly, shocking even those accustomed to hearing of violence during Reconstruction. The scale of the bloodshed could not be ignored. For the first time, federal authorities stepped in, determined to hold someone accountable. Nearly 100 men suspected of involvement were arrested. They were not faceless strangers, they were neighbors, planters, veterans, men whose names were well known in the parishes along the Red River. Their capture sent ripples of unease through the South. For those who had long acted with impunity, this moment seemed to signal a shift. The federal government was finally willing to confront the terror that had shadowed black communities since emancipation. Trials began, and with them came a flicker of hope. Black families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons believed justice might at last be within reach. Prosecutors argued that the attackers had not only committed murder but had violated the civil rights guaranteed under the new amendments to the Constitution. The 14th and 15th Amendments, they said, were written precisely for moments like this, to protect citizens when local authorities refused to do so. But the courtroom proved to be another battleground, and one less favorable to the victims. Defense attorneys argued that the federal government had no authority to intervene, that the crimes committed in Colfax were local matters to be handled under state law. Jurors, many of them sympathetic to the accused, listened closely. The proceedings dragged on, each day filled with technical arguments and bitter disputes over what the Constitution really meant. Some convictions did come. A handful of the men were found guilty, not of murder, but of violating civil rights statutes. Yet even these modest victories were fragile. Appeals moved swiftly through the courts, and soon the case that began in Colfax reached the highest bench in the land, the United States Supreme Court. In 1876, the ruling in United States v. Cruikshank delivered a devastating blow. The court declared that the federal government could not prosecute individuals for acts of racial violence, even when those acts were intended to strip citizens of their constitutional rights. Protection of such rights, the justices said, rested with the states, not with Washington. And in the South of the 1870s, where local officials often turned a blind eye, or even supported the violence, this ruling was effectively a license for impunity. For the families of Colfax, the decision was crushing. The men who had led and carried out the massacre walked free, their convictions overturned. The message was unmistakable: the federal government would not shield black citizens from organized terror. The very amendments meant to guarantee freedom and equality were left hollow, stripped of power by legal interpretation. The consequences reached far beyond Grant Parish. Across the South, groups that had once operated in the shadows now acted with renewed confidence. If nearly 100 men could be arrested for one of the bloodiest massacres of Reconstruction and still escape justice, what was there to fear? Violence surged again at polling places, in courthouses, and in rural towns where freed families tried to exercise their rights. The Colfax case revealed a brutal truth: laws written on paper meant little without the will to enforce them. For black citizens, the dream of Reconstruction seemed to fade with each passing year, as promises of protection gave way to the reality of abandonment. For those who sought to restore the old order, the Supreme Court's ruling was a green light. U.S. v. Cruikshank did more than decide the fate of a few men. It reshaped the meaning of citizenship in America, narrowing the reach of federal power and leaving millions vulnerable. The courthouse in Colfax had been reduced to ashes in 1873, but in 1876, the Supreme Court's decision ensured that its defenders' sacrifices would go unpunished, and its attackers would shape the future unopposed. In the years that followed the Colfax tragedy, the truth of what had happened began to fade, not by accident, but by design. The massacre, which had claimed the lives of more than 100 black defenders, was slowly recast in local memory as something entirely different. Newspapers, politicians, and community leaders spoke of it not as an atrocity, but as a riot, a word that twisted reality until the victims appeared to be the aggressors and the perpetrators were framed as men restoring peace. Language became a weapon. To call it a riot suggested chaos, lawlessness, and mutual blame. It erased the clear imbalance, the fact that a heavily armed force had descended on a courthouse defended by men who eventually surrendered, only to be killed. By changing the words, the meaning of the event itself was rewritten. Those who had resisted were no longer remembered as citizens defending their rights, but as troublemakers who brought violence upon themselves. This distorted memory seeped into the very landscape of Colfax. In the center of town, monuments were erected, not to honor the black men who died in defense of democracy, but to commemorate the handful of white men who lost their lives during the assault. Carved in stone, their deaths were exalted as noble sacrifices, while the far greater number of black victims were consigned to silence. The message was plain: the story belonged to those in power, and they would tell it as they pleased. For black families who had lost fathers, husbands, and sons, the public remembrance was a second wound. They walked past those monuments knowing the names of their loved ones would never be inscribed, their bravery never acknowledged. In schoolbooks, the massacre was barely mentioned. When it was, it appeared as a minor footnote, described in vague terms that mirrored the distorted language of the time. Entire generations grew up hearing a version of history that bore little resemblance to reality. The silence was strategic. By suppressing the memory of what happened, communities could avoid confronting the depth of violence that Reconstruction had unleashed. The myth of the riot allowed local leaders to justify the return of white-dominated rule while denying the scale of the injustice that had taken place. To challenge this narrative was dangerous. Those who spoke openly risked being ostracized, silenced, or worse. Yet memory has a way of surviving, even underground. Families pass down stories in whispers, preserving fragments of truth. Elders told children about fathers who had stood at the courthouse, about brothers who had been taken after surrendering, about the smoke and the fire and the cries that would not fade. These personal accounts carried the weight of history even when the official record denied it. Still, the public monuments remained. Stone markers declared the Colfax riot to be a pivotal moment, celebrating the men who had stormed the courthouse. Travelers passing through the parish could stop and read inscriptions that praised the restoration of order, never realizing that the words before them erased one of the darkest episodes of Reconstruction. For decades, the imbalance endured. The massacre lived in two versions, the official story written in marble and print, and the private memories carried in silence. One version justified the old order, the other kept alive the truth of sacrifice and loss. But only one was visible in the town square, shaping how history was remembered by the wider world. The erasure of the black victims was not just about forgetting, it was about control. To minimize their deaths was to deny the legitimacy of their struggle, to strip them of honor even in memory. By rewriting the past, the forces that had opposed Reconstruction ensured their vision of history would dominate the present. The truth of Colfax lay buried, waiting for a time when it could finally be spoken aloud again. The ashes of the Colfax courthouse may have cooled long ago, but the meaning of what happened there has never disappeared. The massacre was more than an isolated act of violence, it was a window into the fragile state of democracy in a nation still struggling to define itself after war. Laws had been written, rights had been promised, but Colfax revealed the truth that words alone could not secure freedom. Without the will to enforce those laws, without protection against those determined to overturn them, justice was left vulnerable, and the people who depended on it were left exposed. The tragedy also showed how memory itself could be contested ground. By calling the massacre a riot, by raising monuments that honored a few while erasing the many, history was reshaped to suit those in power. That act of forgetting, or rather, of rewriting, was as damaging as the violence itself. A nation that refuses to confront its past risks repeating it, because silence allows the same forces to re-emerge, cloaked in new forms but driven by old impulses. And yet, even in the face of violence and erasure, the defenders of Colfax left behind a legacy. Their stand was not in vain, for it revealed both the courage of those who dared to claim the rights promised to them and the depth of opposition they faced. Their sacrifice forces us to ask difficult questions. What does democracy mean if it can be undone by intimidation? What value do rights hold if they exist only on paper? And what happens when we allow history to be remembered only in ways that comfort, instead of challenge? The lessons of Colfax echo into our own time. The struggle to make democracy real, the tension between law and enforcement, the battle over how history is remembered, these are not relics of the 19th century. They are questions that remain with us, shaping our politics, our communities, and our sense of justice today. To remember Colfax honestly is to recognize the cost of freedom, the dangers of forgetting, and the responsibility each generation carries to defend both truth and rights. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you believe these stories matter, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others so that these voices are never silenced again. Wishing you all a peaceful night's rest, sleep well, and until next time, good night.